A tale of rebellion, courage, and brutal justice in the American Deep South. What happens when years of suffering finally reach their breaking point? When the oppressed decide that death with dignity is better than life in chains? Tonight, we're diving into one of the most powerful untold stories of the American Civil War, a night when enslaved people took control of their destiny, no matter the cost. If stories of courage and human resilience move you, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, because this channel brings you the most gripping historical narratives you won't find anywhere else. The summer of 1862 hung over Magnolia Grove Plantation like a suffocating blanket. The cotton fields stretched endlessly under the merciless Mississippi sun, their white bowls ready for harvest. A harvest that would once again fill the Whitmore family's coffers, while the hands that picked it remained empty. Sarah wiped the sweat from her brow as she moved between the rows, her calloused fingers working with mechanical precision. At 28, she had spent more than half her life in these fields, watching seasons change while her own life remained frozen in bondage. Her dark eyes, once bright with childhood dreams, now held the hardened resolve of someone who had seen too much. The scars on her hands told stories of thorns and rough cotton bolls. But the deeper scars, the ones that couldn't be seen, told stories of children sold away, of friends worked to death, of dreams systematically crushed under the weight of endless servitude. "Sarah," whispered Marcus, working the row beside her. "You hear what happened to Overseer Johnson?" She glanced around nervously before responding. Marcus was 35, a tall man with broad shoulders and intelligent eyes that had learned to hide their sharpness behind a mask of compliance. He'd been born on a plantation in Virginia before being sold south when his first master died. The journey had taken him away from his wife and 2 young children, a separation that had carved a permanent hollow in his chest. "What you mean?" "Gone. Vanished 3 nights ago. They found his horse by the river, but no sign of him." Marcus's voice carried a mixture of fear and something else. Hope, perhaps. "Some say they found blood on the saddle, but Patterson ain't saying much about it." The news sent a ripple through the field workers. Johnson had been the cruelest of the 3 overseers, known for his whip and his particular hatred for anyone who dared meet his gaze. He had a reputation for creative punishments, forcing people to work barefoot on thorny ground, withholding water during the hottest days, separating families as casual discipline. His disappearance felt like divine intervention to some, a dangerous development to others. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded everyone of fire, the field hands moved with practiced efficiency toward the end of another brutal day. The cotton sacks on their backs grew heavier with each passing hour, and the quota, always the quota, hung over them like a sword. Failed to meet it, and faced Johnson's replacement with his own creative interpretations of discipline. Young Anna, barely 16, but already bearing the haunted look of someone much older, stumbled under the weight of her sack. Sarah quickly moved to help her, redistributing some of the cotton to her own already overflowing bag. "Thank you," Anna whispered, tears mixing with the sweat on her face. "We look out for each other," Sarah replied firmly. "That's all we got." Anna had been purchased just 6 months ago from a plantation in Georgia, torn away from her grandmother who had raised her after her parents died of fever. The girl still cried herself to sleep most nights, and Sarah had taken it upon herself to watch over her, seeing in Anna's pain an echo of her own losses. As evening approached, the enslaved community gathered in the quarters, a collection of crude wooden cabins that housed nearly 60 souls. The structures were barely adequate shelter, with gaps in the walls that let in wind and rain, and roofs that leaked during storms. Families of 8 or 10 crowded into spaces barely large enough for 2 people. sleeping on straw mattresses that were replaced only when they rotted completely. The air was thick with tension and whispered conversations. Old Moses, the eldest among them at 72, sat on his porch step, his weathered hands trembling not from age, but from a lifetime of suppressed rage. His cabin was slightly larger than the others, a privilege earned through decades of compliance and the respect even the overseers grudgingly gave to his knowledge of farming and his ability to keep the other enslaved people in line. 34 years, he muttered to no one in particular. 34 years I've been on this land, seen children born into chains, seen good people worked to death, seen families torn apart at auction. His voice grew stronger, carrying the weight of accumulated grief. Seen my own wife die giving birth because the master wouldn't pay for a proper doctor. Seen my son sold away when he was 12 because he learned to read and they said he was getting too smart for his own good. The mention of Moses's son sent a chill through the gathered crowd. Everyone knew the story, but hearing it again reminded them all of their own losses, their own stolen children and separated families. Young Thomas, barely 18 but already bearing the scars of rebellion, stepped forward. His back still showed the marks from his last attempt to resist, 50 lashes for talking back to an overseer who had struck his sister. Maybe it's time things changed. Old Moses, maybe Johnson's disappearance is a sign. Signs don't stop bullets, boy, replied Ezra, a middle-aged man whose back bore the permanent marks of countless lashings. His voice carried the weariness of someone who had tried to rebel before and learned the cost. You talk like that, you'll end up like poor Samuel. The mention of Samuel sent a chill through the group. Just 2 months prior, Samuel had been caught trying to escape after learning that his daughter was to be sold to a plantation in Alabama. The punishment had been swift and public, a reminder to all of what happened to those who dared dream of freedom. They had made everyone watch as Samuel was whipped until he could no longer stand, then chained to a post in the center of the quarters for 3 days without food or water. He had died on the second night, calling out for his daughter until his voice gave out. But Sarah felt something different stirring in her chest. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was determination crystallizing into something harder and more dangerous. "What if we don't run?" she said quietly, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "What if we stay and fight?" The quarters fell silent. Even the crickets seemed to pause their evening song. Children stopped their quiet games and looked up at the adults with wide, frightened eyes. "Fight?" Ezra's voice was barely a whisper. "Sarah, you talking about—" "I'm talking about taking what's ours," she interrupted, standing up. Her voice grew stronger with each word. "This land, watered with our sweat and blood, this cotton picked by our hands, this life that they've stolen from us piece by piece, day by day. I'm talking about making them understand that we're human beings, not property." Marcus stood beside her, his decision crystallizing in the moment. "She's right. We outnumber them. The master, his wife, their 2 sons. And now with Johnson gone, only 2 overseers left. How many times they told us we were 3/5 of a person. Well, 60 times 3/5 is still more than 6 whole people." "And what about the neighbors, the militia?" Ezra challenged, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "You think they'll just let us walk away?" "Who says anything about walking away?" Thomas's young voice carried a steel that surprised everyone. "This is our home too. We built it, we worked it, we bled for it. Every board in that big house, every brick in those walls, we made it with our hands." Ruth, a woman in her 40s who had lost 3 children to the auction block, spoke up from the back of the crowd. "My babies are scattered across 3 states because of these people. I got nothing left to lose. If we're going to die anyway, and we are, one way or another, maybe it's time we died fighting instead of just existing." Old Moses slowly rose to his feet, his ancient bones creaking like the floorboards of the big house. Every eye turned to him, waiting for the wisdom that had guided them through countless hardships. I seen a lot of talk in my time. Talk don't change nothing, but—" He paused, looking around at the faces illuminated by the flickering light of oil lamps. "But I also seen what happens when good people do nothing. Maybe it's time we stopped being good. Maybe it's time we started being free." Working, as if summoned by his words, thunder rumbled in the distance. The storm that had been building all day was finally approaching, and with it, a reckoning that had been decades in the making. The air grew heavy with moisture and electricity, and the first drops of rain began to fall, each one like a drumbeat announcing the beginning of the end. Sarah looked up at the darkening sky, then toward the big house, where warm yellow light spilled from every window, a stark contrast to the dim, cramped quarters where they huddled. The mansion stood like a monument to their suffering, its white columns gleaming in the lamplight, its spacious rooms a mockery of their cramped existence. "Tomorrow night," she said firmly, her voice carrying across the quarters with the authority of someone who had finally found her purpose. "When the storm hits, that's when we take back what was never theirs to begin with." The decision hung in the air like the approaching lightning, electric and dangerous. Some nodded in agreement, others looked terrified, but all understood that there would be no going back from this moment. They had crossed a line that existed not just in their minds, but in the very fabric of their reality. In the distance, the first drops of rain began to fall harder, and the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of change and the promise of a reckoning that had been building for generations. The next morning brought an oppressive humidity that seemed to press down on Magnolia Grove like a giant's hand. The air was thick enough to cut, and even the birds seemed reluctant to sing in the suffocating heat. Overseer Patterson rode through the fields on his chestnut mare, his eyes constantly scanning for signs of trouble. Johnson's disappearance had left him and Overseer Mills responsible for managing 60 enslaved people, a task that now felt impossible. Patterson was a different man than Johnson had been. Where Johnson had ruled through fear and brutality, Patterson relied on a complex system of small privileges and punishments. He understood that a well-fed slave worked better than a starving one, and that occasional small kindnesses could prevent larger rebellions. He wasn't kind. Kindness was a luxury no overseer could afford. But he wasn't unnecessarily cruel either. This morning, however, his usual confidence was shaken. The disappearance of Johnson had created a power vacuum that he could feel in the very air around him. The enslaved people moved through their morning routines with an efficiency that might have seemed normal to a casual observer, but Patterson's trained eye caught the subtle differences. Conversation stopped too quickly when he approached. Eyes that usually stayed fixed on the ground now darted up to meet his before quickly looking away. There was an electricity in the air that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. "You there, Marcus," he called out, his voice carrying across the cotton field. "Come here." Marcus straightened up from the cotton plants, his heart racing. Had someone overheard their conversation last night? Had word somehow reached the overseers? He walked slowly toward the mounted overseer, his mind racing through possible explanations, possible lies, possible ways to protect the others if he had been discovered. "Yes, sir, Mr. Patterson." Patterson studied Marcus's face intently. The enslaved man's expression was carefully neutral, but there was something different about his posture, something almost defiant in the way he held his shoulders. "You hear anything about Johnson? Any talk among your people about what might have happened to him?" Marcus kept his expression carefully neutral, drawing on years of practice in hiding his thoughts from white men who held his life in their hands. "No, sir. We just heard he was gone. Folks are scared, wondering if something bad happened to him. Some thinking maybe he just decided to leave, find work somewhere else." "Johnson wouldn't just leave," Patterson said sharply. "He had a good position here, good pay. Something happened to him, and I aim to find out what." "Yes, sir. If I hear anything, I'll be sure to let you know." Patterson studied Marcus's face intently. He had been managing enslaved labor for 15 years and had developed an instinct for detecting lies. But Marcus's expression revealed nothing. Years of survival had taught him to school his features into perfect compliance, even when his heart was racing with fear and anticipation. "Well, you tell your people that anyone with information about Johnson will be rewarded. Extra rations, maybe even a day of rest, and anyone caught lying." He let the threat hang in the air like the humidity. "Yes, sir. I'll tell them." As Patterson rode away, Marcus felt a bead of sweat roll down his spine that had nothing to do with the heat. The net was tightening, and their window of opportunity was shrinking with each passing hour. He looked around the field, catching the eyes of others who had been part of last night's conversation. A slight nod here, a meaningful glance there. The message was clear. Tonight or never. Meanwhile, in the big house, the Whitmore family was dealing with their own crisis. The mansion, with its high ceilings and spacious rooms, should have been a refuge from the oppressive heat, but today it felt more like a prison. Master Charles Whitmore, a portly man in his 50s with thinning hair and a perpetually red face, paced back and forth in his study, while his wife Margaret sat rigidly in her chair, her knitting forgotten in her lap. The study was a monument to Charles's success. Leather-bound books lined the walls. Expensive paintings depicted pastoral scenes that bore no resemblance to the reality of plantation life, and a massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room. Every item in the room represented wealth built on the backs of enslaved labor, though Charles had long ago stopped thinking about that connection. "This is intolerable, Charles," Margaret said, her voice tight with anxiety. She was a thin woman with sharp features and pale skin that never seemed to tan, despite years in the southern sun. Her hands shook slightly as she spoke, a tremor that had developed over the past few days. First Johnson disappears, and now the slaves are acting different. I can feel it. Different how? Asked their eldest son, Robert, a young man of 22 who had recently returned from university in Virginia. He had inherited his father's build and his mother's sharp features, along with an arrogance that came from never having been denied anything he wanted. "They're not meeting our eyes the way they used to. There's something defiant about them. Yesterday, that girl Sarah actually looked directly at me when I gave her instructions. In the old days, she would have kept her head down, said, 'Yes, Mom,' and scurried away. But yesterday, she looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time." Margaret's voice carried a note of genuine fear. She had spent her entire adult life surrounded by enslaved people who moved through her world like shadows, invisible unless she needed something. The idea that they might be truly seeing her, truly thinking about her, was more terrifying than any physical threat. Charles stopped pacing and turned to his family, his face flushed with heat and frustration. "Perhaps it's time we sent for additional help. My brother in Alabama has offered to lend us some of his overseers before, men who know how to handle difficult situations." "Father," interrupted their younger son, William, who at 19 still possessed some of the idealism of youth, "maybe we should consider that our methods might be part of the problem. I've been reading about some plantations that have had success with what?" Charles's voice rose dangerously, his face growing even redder. "Coddling them? Treating them like equals? William, you may have book learning, but you don't understand the reality of managing these people. Give them an inch, and they'll take a mile. They're like children. They need firm guidance and clear boundaries. But, Father, surely there's a middle ground between cruelty and—" "Cruelty?" Margaret's voice was sharp as a blade. "We provide them with food, shelter, clothing, and purpose. In return, they provide labor. It's a fair arrangement that has worked for generations. They're better off here than they would be in Africa, living like savages." Robert nodded in agreement with his mother, his university education having only reinforced his sense of racial superiority. "William, you've been away at university too long. You've forgotten what these people are really like. They're not capable of the same reasoning and moral development as we are. It's simply their nature. The professors up north fill young men's heads with romantic notions about equality, but they've never had to manage a plantation." William fell silent, but his discomfort was evident. He had indeed been exposed to different ideas at university, ideas about human dignity and natural rights that seemed to contradict everything he had been raised to believe. The cognitive dissonance was becoming harder to ignore, especially when he looked into the eyes of the enslaved people who served his family and saw intelligence, pain, and something that looked disturbingly like judgment. As the family debated, none of them noticed the figure of Lily, a young enslaved woman who worked in the house, standing just outside the study door. She had been dusting the hallway when the conversation began, and now she listened with growing alarm to their plans for additional help. Her hands trembled as she held her cleaning cloth, and she had to force herself to breathe quietly. Lily had been born in the big house and had spent her entire 19 years moving through its rooms like a ghost, invisible to the family she served. She had learned to read by watching the Whitmore children's lessons from doorways and corners, had absorbed their conversations and their casual cruelties with the patience of someone who had no choice but to endure. But invisibility had its advantages. She heard things, saw things, learned things that field hands never could. She knew about the hidden safe behind the painting in Charles's study, knew about Margaret's laudanum habit that was growing worse each year, knew about Robert's gambling debts and William's growing doubts about the family business. She had become a repository of secrets, a silent witness to the private moments when the Whitmore family dropped their public masks. When the conversation finally ended and the family dispersed, Lily quickly finished her dusting and made her way to the kitchen, where she found Cook, an elderly woman named Bessie, who had been on the plantation longer than anyone except old Moses. Bessie was a small, round woman with greying hair and hands that bore the scars of decades of kitchen work, but her eyes were sharp and missed nothing. "Bessie," Lily whispered urgently, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "They're talking about bringing in more overseers, and Mrs. Whitmore says the field hands are acting different." Bessie's weathered hands paused in their kneading of bread dough. She had lived through 3 generations of Whitmores and had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when trouble was brewing. The kitchen was her domain, the one place in the big house where she had some measure of control, and she used it as a gathering point for information from both the house and the fields. Different how? Defiant, she said, not keeping their heads down like they used to. "And Mr. Charles wants to bring in his brother's overseers from Alabama." Bessie nodded slowly, her mind working through the implications. She had heard whispers from the field hands who came to the kitchen for their meager meals, had seen the way they looked at each other when they thought no one was watching. "Storm's coming," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "And I don't mean just the weather." "What should we do?" Bessie looked at the young woman who had been like a daughter to her, seeing in Lily's frightened eyes the same fear she had carried for decades. "You get word to Sarah and the others. Tell them the family's getting suspicious. And tell them—" Bessie paused, looking around to make sure they were alone. "Tell them that if they're planning something, it better be soon. Because if more overseers come, whatever chance they have now will be gone forever." The weight of the message settled on Lily's shoulders like a physical burden. She nodded, understanding that she was now part of something larger than herself, something that could mean freedom or death for everyone she cared about. As afternoon faded into evening, the message spread through the plantation like wildfire. Field hands whispered to house servants, House servants passed word to stable hands, and stable hands carried the news back to the quarters. The network of communication that had developed over years of shared oppression now served a new purpose: coordination for the most dangerous night of their lives. The time for planning was over, the storm was coming, and with it, their moment of truth. In his cabin, old Moses sat sharpening a rusty knife he had hidden beneath his floorboards for 20 years, a knife he had sworn he would only use when freedom was within reach, or death was the only alternative. The blade was old and pitted, but it would serve its purpose. That night had finally come. The storm arrived with the fury of divine judgment, as if the heavens themselves had decided to bear witness to what was about to unfold. By 8 o'clock that evening, rain lashed against the windows of the big house, while thunder shook the very foundations of Magnolia Grove. The wind howled through the trees like the voices of all the enslaved people who had died on this land, and lightning split the sky with such frequency that night and day seemed to blur together. In the slave quarters, 60 souls huddled in their cabins, but tonight was different. Tonight they were not hiding from the storm, but waiting for it to provide the cover they needed. The rain drummed against the thin walls of their shelters, and water seeped through the gaps in the wood. But no one complained about the discomfort. They had lived with discomfort their entire lives. Tonight it might finally serve a purpose. Sarah stood at the window of her cabin, watching the lightning illuminate the path between the quarters and the big house. Each flash revealed the landscape she had known all her life, but tonight it looked different. Tonight it looked like a battlefield. The familiar cotton fields, the slave quarters, the overseer houses, and the imposing mansion all took on new significance in the stark light of the storm. "You sure about this?" whispered her cabin mate, Ruth, a woman in her 40s who had lost 3 children to the auction block. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had already lost everything that mattered and was now risking the little that remained. "I'm sure that I can't live another day like this," Sarah replied without turning from the window. "And I'm sure that if we don't act tonight, we never will. The storm won't last forever, and neither will our courage." Ruth nodded, understanding. She had been thinking the same thing for years, but had never found the strength to act on it. Tonight felt different, though. Tonight felt like the culmination of a lifetime of accumulated grievances, a moment when the universe itself seemed to be conspiring to give them their chance. A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Marcus entered, followed by Thomas and 6 other men, all carrying farming tools that could serve as weapons: hoes, scythes, hammers, and axes. Their faces were grim but determined, and their clothes were already soaked from moving between the cabins in the rain. The tools in their hands, worn smooth by years of labor, now felt different in their grip, no longer instruments of servitude, but weapons of liberation. "Patterson and Mills are both in the overseer house," Marcus reported quietly, water dripping from his hair as he spoke. "Lights are on, but with this storm, they won't hear us coming. They're probably drinking. Patterson always drinks when he's nervous, and he's been nervous all day." "What about the big house?" asked Thomas, his young face set with determination that made him look older than his 18 years. "Lily says the family's all inside. Master Charles is in his study with his account books, the missus is in the parlor with her sewing, and the boys are in the library playing chess. The house slaves are in the kitchen quarters, except for Lily and Bessie, who are with us." The mention of the house slaves joining them sent a ripple of excitement through the group. Having allies inside the big house would make their task infinitely easier, and it meant that their rebellion had spread beyond just the field hands. Old Moses appeared in the doorway, moving with surprising agility for his age. In his gnarled hands, he carried the knife he had been sharpening, its blade now gleaming despite its age. Behind him came Ezra, Anna, and a dozen others, all armed with whatever they could find. The sight of old Moses, the eldest and most respected among them, joining their cause, seemed to give everyone new strength. "Time to go," he said simply, his voice carrying the authority of 7 decades of accumulated wisdom and pain. Sarah turned from the window and picked up a heavy iron poker from the fireplace. The weight of it in her hands felt right, felt powerful. Around her, the others armed themselves with whatever they could find. These were not weapons of war, but tools of labor transformed by desperation into instruments of liberation. A cotton hook became a spear, a hammer became a club, a scythe became a sword. "Remember," Sarah addressed the group, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to do. "We're not murderers. We're people taking back what was stolen from us. But if they fight us—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood that this night would end in either freedom or death, and they were prepared for either outcome. The group moved out into the storm, their dark clothing making them nearly invisible against the night. The rain soaked through their thin garments within seconds, but none of them felt the cold. Their blood was running too hot for that, pumped by adrenaline and the intoxicating possibility of freedom. They moved like shadows across the plantation grounds, their bare feet silent on the muddy earth. The storm provided perfect cover. The thunder masked any sounds they might make, and the lightning, while it illuminated them briefly, also blinded anyone who might be watching from the windows. They reached the overseer house first, a modest 2-story structure that stood between the slave quarters and the big house like a checkpoint. Through the windows, they could see Patterson and Mills sitting at a table, playing cards and drinking whiskey. The irony was not lost on any of them. While the enslaved people planned their liberation, their oppressors were gambling and drinking, completely unaware of the storm about to break over their heads. Marcus and Thomas approached the front door, while the others surrounded the small building. Sarah could see the tension in their movements, the way they held their makeshift weapons, the careful coordination that spoke of a plan rehearsed in whispers over the past 24 hours. At Sarah's nod, Marcus kicked the door open with a crash that was immediately swallowed by the thunder. The sound of splintering wood mixed with the roar of the storm, and suddenly they were inside, water streaming from their clothes, their weapons gleaming in the lamplight. Patterson jumped to his feet, his hand reaching for the pistol at his belt, but Thomas was faster. The young man's hoe caught Patterson across the chest, sending him sprawling backward over his chair. The cards scattered across the floor, and the whiskey bottle shattered against the wall, filling the air with the smell of alcohol and fear. Mills tried to run for the back door, but found his way blocked by old Moses, whose ancient eyes held a lifetime of accumulated fury. The old man stood in the doorway like an avenging angel, his knife gleaming in his weathered hand. "Please," Mills stammered, his face pale with terror. "I never hurt nobody. I was always fair to you people. I never used the whip unless I had to." "Fair?" Old Moses's voice was barely audible over the storm, but it carried the weight of decades of suffering. "You think there's such a thing as a fair master, a fair overseer? You think there's a fair way to own another human being?" The confrontation was brief and decisive. Within minutes, both overseers were bound and gagged, their weapons confiscated. Sarah looked down at Patterson, who stared up at her with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The man who had controlled every aspect of her daily life for years was now helpless at her feet, and the reversal was so complete that it felt almost surreal. "You always wondered what we were thinking when we looked at the ground, instead of meeting your eyes," she said quietly, her voice carrying over the storm. "Now you know. We were thinking about this moment. We were planning this moment. Every day, every hour, every minute, we were waiting for this moment." The group left the overseers tied up and moved toward the big house. The storm was reaching its peak now, with lightning striking so frequently that the night seemed to flicker between darkness and brilliant illumination. In those flashes, the mansion looked like something from a fever dream, its white columns stark against the black sky, its windows glowing with warm light that seemed to mock the cold reality of the quarters. The house loomed before them like a fortress of privilege, its imposing facade a monument to the wealth built on their backs. Every brick, every board, every ornate detail represented their stolen labor, their unpaid wages, their sacrificed lives. Tonight, they would finally enter through the front door as human beings, not as property. They approached the house from multiple directions, their movements coordinated with the precision of a military operation. Sarah and Marcus went to the front door, while Thomas and others positioned themselves at the back and side entrances. Old Moses, despite his age, insisted on going with Sarah to the front. "I want to walk through that front door," he said, his voice filled with a determination that transcended his physical frailty. "Just once in my life, I want to walk through the front door of this house like a human being, not like some animal being brought in for inspection." Sarah nodded, understanding the profound symbolism of the moment. For generations, enslaved people had entered this house only through the back door, only as servants and property. Tonight, they would enter as equals, as human beings claiming their rightful place in the world. She raised her hand, and when lightning flashed again, illuminating their faces with stark clarity, she brought it down in signal. They burst through the doors simultaneously, the sound of splintering wood mixing with the crash of thunder. The carefully maintained order of the big house was shattered in an instant, replaced by the chaos of revolution and the raw power of human beings who had finally decided to claim their freedom. In the parlor, Margaret Whitmore looked up from her sewing with an expression of complete incomprehension. For a moment, she seemed unable to process what she was seeing. Enslaved people, armed and determined, standing in her parlor like they belonged there. The needle fell from her trembling fingers, and her face went white as she realized that her world was ending. What is the meaning of this?" she stammered, rising from her chair on unsteady legs. "The meaning," said Sarah, stepping forward with her iron poker gleaming in the lamplight, "is that we're taking back what was always ours." From the study came the sound of Charles Whitmore shouting, followed by a crash as Thomas and his group encountered the master of the house. Robert's voice could be heard from the library, calling for his father in a tone that mixed confusion with growing fear. Margaret backed against the wall, her face pale with terror, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. "You can't do this. This is our home. We own this land. You own nothing," old Moses interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of 7 decades of suffering. "You never owned nothing but the delusion that one human being can own another." The storm raged outside, but inside the big house, a different kind of tempest was breaking. The natural order that had seemed as permanent as the stars was crumbling, and in its place, something new and terrible and beautiful was being born. As lightning illuminated the parlor, Sarah saw herself reflected in the mirror above the mantelpiece. A woman with a weapon in her hand, standing in the forbidden space of the big house, no longer a slave but not yet free. She was something in between, something dangerous and powerful and utterly unprecedented. The revolution had begun, and there would be no turning back. The confrontation in the big house unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of justice, each movement deliberate and charged with the weight of generations of oppression finally finding its voice. In the study, Charles Whitmore found himself face to face with Thomas and 3 other men, their farming tools, now weapons of liberation. The room that had served as the nerve center of the plantation's operations, where decisions about human lives were made with the same casual indifference as choosing which fields to plant, was now the scene of a complete reversal of power. Charles's hand reached for the rifle mounted above his fireplace, a weapon that had been more symbol than necessity until this moment. But Marcus was quicker, knocking the weapon away with his scythe before Charles could even touch it. The rifle clattered to the floor, its polished wood and metal a stark contrast to the rough tools that now held dominance in the room. "Sit down, Master Whitmore," Thomas said, his young voice carrying an authority that would have been unthinkable just hours before. The title Master dripped with irony now, a mockery of the power structure that had defined their entire world. "You've lost your minds," Charles sputtered, his face red with rage and disbelief. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the coolness brought by the storm. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? They'll hunt you down like animals. They'll hang every last one of you from the nearest tree. The militia, the neighbors, the whole county will come for you." "Maybe," Thomas replied calmly, his grip steady on his makeshift weapon, "but we won't die as slaves. We'll die as human beings who chose their own fate." The words hung in the air like a challenge to the natural order itself. Charles stared at the young man he had watched grow up in the fields, seeing him now as if for the first time, not as property, but as a person with thoughts, feelings, and the capacity for rebellion that he had never imagined possible. In the library, Robert and William Whitmore huddled together as Ezra and two others entered. The room, lined with leather-bound books that represented knowledge and culture, now became a classroom of a different sort, one where the enslaved became the teachers and the masters became the students. William, the younger son who had questioned his family's methods just that morning, looked at the enslaved men with something approaching understanding. His university education had exposed him to ideas about human dignity and natural rights, and now those abstract concepts were taking concrete form before his eyes. Robert, however, was defiant to the end. "Father will have you all killed for this," he declared, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and outrage. "You're making the biggest mistake of your miserable lives." "The biggest mistake of our lives," Ezra replied, his scarred back straight with a dignity that had been beaten but never broken, "was being born into a world where people like you think they can own people like us." But it was in the parlor where the most profound transformation was taking place. Margaret Whitmore, the woman who had spent her entire adult life giving orders to enslaved people, treating them as extensions of her will rather than as human beings with their own thoughts and feelings, now found herself at the mercy of Sarah and old Moses. The reversal was so complete, so absolute, that it seemed to break something fundamental in her understanding of reality. The parlor, with its expensive furniture and delicate decorations, had always been her sanctuary, a place where she could retreat from the harsh realities of plantation life and surround herself with beauty and comfort. Now it had become the stage for her reckoning, where the true cost of that comfort was finally being presented to her. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "I have children. I have a family." "So did we," Sarah replied quietly, her voice carrying the weight of countless losses. "So did all of us. But that never stopped you from selling our children, from working our families to death, from treating us like livestock to be bought and sold at your convenience." Old Moses stepped forward, his weathered face illuminated by the flickering lamplight. The years had carved deep lines into his features, each one a testament to suffering endured and dignity maintained, despite impossible circumstances. "Mrs. Whitmore, you remember my grandson Joshua?" Margaret's eyes widened with recognition and fear. Joshua had been sold 3 years earlier to pay for Robert's university education, a transaction that had been as casual to her as buying a new dress. "He was 8 years old," old Moses continued, his voice steady but filled with a pain that had never healed. "8 years old when you sold him to that trader from New Orleans. You remember what you said when I begged you not to separate him from his mama?" Margaret's lips moved soundlessly, her face pale as the memory returned with devastating clarity. "You said, 'Moses, you people don't form the same attachments we do. It's not the same for you.' You remember that?" Tears began to stream down Margaret's face, but old Moses wasn't finished. The words he had carried for 3 years, the pain he had swallowed every day, finally found their voice. "Well, Mrs. Whitmore, I want you to know that it was exactly the same for us. Every bit of love, every bit of pain, every bit of loss, exactly the same. And tonight, you're going to understand what it feels like to have your world torn apart." The storm outside was beginning to subside, but inside the house, the real reckoning was just beginning. Sarah moved through the rooms, seeing them with new eyes. The ornate furniture, the expensive paintings, the crystal chandeliers, all of it built on the backs of people who had never been allowed to own so much as the clothes on their backs. In the dining room, she found the family's silver service laid out on the mahogany table, ready for the next day's meals. Each piece represented months of labor in the fields, years of stolen wages, lifetimes of unpaid work. She picked up a silver candlestick, feeling its weight in her hands. Not just its physical weight, but the weight of all the labor that had paid for it. "Lily!" she called to the house slave who had been cowering in the corner, torn between loyalty to the family she had served and solidarity with her own people. "Come here." Lily approached hesitantly, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. She had spent her entire life in this house, had been raised to see the Whitmore family as her superiors, and the complete reversal of power was almost too much for her to process. "This silver," Sarah said, holding up the candlestick. "How many hours you think you spent polishing it?" I don't know, Miss Sarah. Don't call me miss. We're equals now. And I want you to think about all those hours, all that work, all that time you spent making their lives comfortable while you slept on a straw mattress in a room no bigger than a closet." Understanding began to dawn in Lily's eyes, and with it came a transformation that was both beautiful and terrible to witness. The young woman who had been trained to see herself as inferior, as naturally suited for servitude, was beginning to see herself as a human being with the same rights and dignity as anyone else. What happens now?" "Now we decide," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the weight of leadership that had emerged naturally from the chaos. "We decide what kind of people we want to be. We decide whether we're going to let anger turn us into the monsters they always said we were, or whether we're going to be better than they ever were." The group gathered in the main parlor. The Whitmore family huddled together on one side, while the formerly enslaved people stood on the other. The symbolic reversal was complete. The masters had become the supplicants. The slaves had become the arbiters of justice. The room that had hosted countless dinner parties and social gatherings, where the business of human bondage had been discussed over fine wine and delicate pastries, was now the courtroom where that system would be judged. Charles Whitmore, his bluster finally exhausted by the reality of his situation, looked up at Sarah with something approaching respect. The woman he had seen every day for years, but had never truly looked at, was now the most powerful person in the room, and the irony was not lost on him. "What do you want?" "What do we want?" Sarah repeated the question, looking around at her companions. Each face told a story of suffering and resilience, of dreams deferred but never destroyed. "We want our lives back. We want our families back. We want our dignity back. But since we can't have those things..." She paused, considering the weight of her next words. "We want you to understand what you took from us. And then we leave, all of us, together, and you can explain to your neighbors how you lost control of your plantation to the people you thought you owned." Margaret looked up sharply, hope flickering in her eyes for the first time since the ordeal began. "You're not going to kill us?" Old Moses answered her, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had seen enough death to last several lifetimes. "Mrs. Whitmore, if we were the savages you always said we were, you'd already be dead. But we're not. We're human beings, and human beings don't have to become monsters to claim their freedom." The words carried a moral authority that was impossible to deny. In that moment, the formerly enslaved people proved themselves to be more civilized, more humane than the civilization that had enslaved them. As dawn approached, the storm finally passed, leaving the air clean and fresh. The enslaved people of Magnolia Grove gathered their few possessions and prepared to leave the only home most of them had ever known. They had no clear destination, no plan beyond the simple determination to be free, but they had something more valuable than any plan. They had their dignity, their humanity, and their unshakable belief in their right to freedom. Sarah stood on the front porch of the big house, looking out over the cotton fields that had been both her prison and her world. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that seemed to promise new beginnings. The familiar landscape looked different now, not like a prison, but like a place where something important had happened, where history had been made by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Thomas joined her on the porch, his young face marked by the events of the night, but also by a new maturity that came from having stood up for what was right. "You think we'll make it?" "I don't know," Sarah replied honestly, her voice carrying both uncertainty and determination. "But I know we'll die free, and that's more than we had yesterday." One by one, the others joined them. Old Moses, moving slowly but with dignity that no amount of suffering had been able to break. Marcus, carrying a small bundle that contained everything he owned in the world. Ruth, holding the hand of young Anna, who had found in the night's events not just freedom, but a new family. Ezra, his scarred back straight with pride for the first time in decades. They walked down the front steps of the big house and onto the road that led away from Magnolia Grove. Behind them, the Whitmore family watched from the windows, their world forever changed by a single night of reckoning. The plantation that had seemed like an eternal institution, as permanent as the land itself, had been revealed to be nothing more than a house of cards built on the foundation of human suffering. As they walked, the sun climbed higher, burning away the last traces of the storm. The road ahead was uncertain, dangerous, and filled with challenges that would test every ounce of their courage and determination. But for the first time in their lives, it was their road to choose. Sarah looked back once at the plantation that had defined her existence for 28 years. Then she turned her face toward the rising sun and walked forward into freedom, whatever the cost might be. The rebellion of Magnolia Grove was over, but the revolution in the hearts of 60 human beings was just beginning. 6 months later, newspapers across the South would report on the Magnolia Grove incident, a mysterious event where an entire plantation's enslaved population simply vanished overnight, leaving behind only confused owners and a story that no one quite believed. Some said they had been helped by Union soldiers. Others claimed it was the work of abolitionists from the North. But those who knew the truth understood that sometimes the most powerful force for change comes not from outside intervention, but from the simple human refusal to accept injustice any longer. Of the 60 people who walked away from Magnolia Grove that morning, historical records show that 43 made it to Union lines, where they joined the growing ranks of formerly enslaved people fighting for their own freedom. 17 others disappeared into the complex network of free black communities that existed throughout the South, creating new lives under new names. Sarah became a nurse with the Union Army, using skills she had learned caring for the sick in the slave quarters. Old Moses lived to see the end of the war and the abolition of slavery, dying peacefully in 1867 at the age of 77. Thomas joined the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment and fought with distinction until the war's end. The Whitmore family never recovered from that night. Charles died of a heart attack 2 years later, and Margaret spent her remaining years as a recluse, haunted by the memory of looking into the eyes of people she had never truly seen as human. Robert moved to Texas after the war, while William became a teacher and spent his life working for racial reconciliation. But perhaps the most important legacy of that stormy night in 1862 was not what happened to any individual, but what it represented. The moment when human beings decided that their dignity was worth more than their safety, when they chose the uncertain promise of freedom over the familiar chains of bondage. In the end, the storm that broke over Magnolia Grove was not just about one plantation or one group of people. It was about the fundamental truth that no human being can be owned, that justice delayed is not justice denied, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against oppression is simply the refusal to accept it any longer. The lightning that illuminated the plantation that night revealed more than just the path to the big house. It revealed the path to a new understanding of what it means to be human, to be free, and to be willing to fight for both. If this story of courage and human resilience moved you, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. History is full of untold stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and we're here to bring them to light. What would you have done in Sarah's position? Would you have had the courage to risk everything for freedom? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to share this story with others who need to hear it. For more incredible historical narratives that will challenge your perspective and touch your heart, check out our playlist of untold stories from America's past. Because sometimes the most important history is the history that was never written down until now. Remember, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and the cost of silence is the perpetuation of injustice. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next story.